Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Matthew Byer, and I am the Museum Education and Engagement Coordinator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll have a better understanding of Iowa's contentious debate over the federal and state Equal Rights Amendment, with a focus on the 26 years from 1972 to 1998. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. This webinar will be recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Kennedy Riker, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions. And now on to introductions. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Carrie Kedrowski. Dr. Kedrowski is director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics and the Whitaker Lindgren Faculty Fellow and Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University. Karen earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where she majored in political science, French, and history. She then earned her Master of Arts degree and PhD in political science from the University of Oklahoma, Norman. Her research agenda focuses primarily on women in politics and civic engagement. She is the author, co-author, or editor of 4 books and more than 60 book chapters, book reviews, journal articles, encyclopedia entries, and blog posts. She also leads Iowa State's voter engagement efforts, which have earned several national recognitions. In addition, Karen is frequently interviewed by local, regional, national, and international news organizations. Prior to coming to Iowa State, Kedrowski spent 24 years at Winthrop University, where she held many leadership roles. She received Winthrop's highest honor, Distinguished Professor, in 2011. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Kedrowski to begin the webinar.
Hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm happy to be here. So, as you heard from my introduction, I'm a political scientist by training, but sometimes I like to hang out with historians too, and that's what led me down the path to discovering Iowa and the Equal Rights Amendment. This year, 2023, is the 100th anniversary of the Equal Rights Amendment introduction into the U.S. Congress. And I received a grant from the Hard Won Not Done organization that celebrated the centennial of the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And I used that to design a high school curriculum on the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, since that is not well known by the current crop of teachers and certainly not by their students. In the process, I learned that Iowa's story about the Equal Rights Amendment was fascinating in its own right. And that led me to you here today. So a little bit, the title of my presentation is My Greatest Desire Before I Die to Be in the Iowa Constitution. And that quotation the relevance of that quotation will be apparent in a few minutes. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced in 1923, and it was the brainchild and the next chapter of her life's work for this suffragist, Alice Paul. And the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced into every Congress until it was eventually passed in 1972, which is 49 years later. Interestingly enough, there was always a great deal of controversy over the Equal Rights Amendment, and there was even controversy within the feminist community. So various equality feminists like Alice Paul, pictured here, wanted the constitutional equality, and they thought that that would override or be more important than any sort of special rights or privileges that women had that would then end up ending because of the Equal Rights Amendment. By contrast, Carrie Chapman Catt and other social feminists opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. They were working very hard to pass so-called women's protective legislation, especially for women in the workplace, for things like mandatory maximum work hours, mandatory breaks and other kinds of things, safety procedures, things that are now really available to everyone, first were enacted on behalf of women. And these social feminists realized that these reforms that they were working so hard for would be overturned if the Equal Rights Amendment were passed. Nonetheless, what we found was that there was substantial support in a number of kind of surprising quarters. For example, Iowa Senator Guy Gillette was the lead sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1943. And in 1972, when the Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress, all of Iowa's members of Congress and senators voted in favor of the amendment. The only exception was Representative Fred Schwengel, who was absent. So then the Equal Rights Amendment came to the Iowa legislature. So Iowa became the 4th state to ratify the national ERA on March 24th in 1972. The legislature that year was within a couple of days of adjourning. And once the Congress had passed this, there was a real effort on the part of several women, specifically Joan Lipsky, Minette Dorderer, and Charlene Conklin, to suspend the rules and to bring the Equal Rights Amendment to the floor of the legislature before the legislature adjourned. They wanted Iowa to be among the first states to ratify. And it passed overwhelmingly. As you can see, the tallies there. Is that it passed with nominal opposition in the Iowa House, and only one senator, a Democrat from Newton, Eugene Hill, voted against it in the Iowa Senate. Interestingly enough, U.S. Senator Charles Grassley was in the Iowa House of Representatives when this passed. And even though he said that he had personal reservations about the Equal Rights Amendment, he voted in favor of it because he wanted to have a political future in Iowa. Starting in 1973, however, we see that there's significant opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment that begins to develop. And it is developed at the hand of the woman who's pictured here, Phyllis Schlafly of Alton, Iowa. In late 1972, she organized a conference to start chapters in opposition of the Equal Rights Amendment. The major group that she had was called Stop ERA, for Stop Taking Our Privileges. And in early 1973, Nebraska, which had been the 2nd state to ratify, rescinded its ratification. And Nebraska, our neighboring state, became the first of 5 states that rescinded their ratifications of the Equal Rights Amendment before 1982. Iowa had its own opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, founded at about the same time, and the 2 primary organizations are listed here. The Iowa Women Against the Equal Rights Amendment, which was founded by Donna Laporte in Des Moines, and My Right to Be a Woman, which was founded by Crayola Paradise in Sioux City. So what were the arguments about the Equal Rights Amendment? The proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment talked a lot about constitutional equality and the principles of equality and liberty and freedom. They also wanted to ensure that women were covered by the citizenship protections that were in the 14th Amendment. Shockingly, the Supreme Court did not actually rule that women were covered by the 14th Amendment until 1976. So in 1972, when the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress, this was still something of an open question. They also said that the Equal Rights Amendment would eliminate pay discrimination and lead to equal pay between women and men. And the pay gap in 1972 was 59 cents, with women earning 59 cents for every dollar that a man earned. They also argued later, much later, that the Equal Rights Amendment would provide a constitutional protection for abortion rights. The final thing, strict scrutiny, is again a legal principle, but under jurisprudence that's been developed under the Supreme Court cases, race, national origin, religion, are subject to the very highest level of judicial scrutiny, strict scrutiny. So if there is an example of discrimination, for example, on the basis of race, it's almost impossible for the defendant to be able to justify that. It has to be just an absolutely overwhelming interest. Sex discrimination is subject to something called intermediate scrutiny. So there are times when the government's interest in discrimination on the basis of sex is, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, acceptable. What the Equal Rights Amendment would do, one of the things that it would do would be to raise sex discrimination to the same level as discrimination on the basis of race or religion and subject to strict scrutiny. Now, opponents argued a number of different things. Number one was that the Equal Rights Amendment was not needed because of all of the other kinds of legislation and court cases that were going through in the 1970s, and moreover, that women didn't want it. Secondly, they had a number of sort of fear-mongering arguments that it would lead to gay marriage and for gays and lesbians to be able to teach in public schools and to adopt children. They also warned that women would be drafted and would be placed into combat roles in the military. They also said that it would lead to unisex public restrooms, locker rooms, prisons, and gyms. And what this was really sort of this notion that there would be, that this would subject women to sexual assault because there would be predatory men waiting to attack them in these previously private and sex segregated spaces. They also thought that it would undermine protective legislation on the part of women, especially various labor laws, even though most of these had either been expanded to men as well as women, or they were no longer in place. And the opponents also argued that the Equal Rights Amendment would enshrine abortion in the Constitution. Coming back to Iowa, we see that Iowa had its very own rescission attempt. And it was introduced by this gentleman pictured here, Senator Eugene Hill, who is a Democrat from Newton. And he presented on the floor of the Senate a petition signed by 4,000 Iowa women. And he had this read into the record, indicating that these 4,000 signatories opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. And he did this in 1975, and he promised to introduce a rescission resolution in the next state legislative session. He did so in March 1977, and his rescission proposal had 13 co-sponsors in the state Senate. And the women that also opposed the Equal Rights Amendment lobbied the state legislature very heavily, including distributing loaves of bread with the message, vote for the homemaker and rescind the ERA. The principal opponents of the rescission amendment were Philip Hill, who was a Republican from Des Moines, and Minette Dorderer, who is a Democrat from Iowa City. There were no floor hearings and no hearings and no floor action. And Senator Hill here was Eugene Hill was defeated in 1978 after 20 years in the state legislature, in part because of his opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, in response to this, then, Senator Hill had promised that the Senate would take up rescission again after the election in 1978. Instead, however, what Senator Hill decided to do, and this is Philip Hill and Minette Dorderer here pictured here, what they decided to do instead of dealing with rescission was to work for a state Equal Rights Amendment. So this was an amendment to the Iowa State Constitution. And Philip Hill justified this by saying we don't know what's going to happen to the federal Equal Rights Amendment. So what we can do is join other states that are passing these kinds of amendments and add it to our state constitution. By 1980, the original deadline for ratification of the national ERA had passed, that had passed in 1979, and the US Congress had passed a 3-year extension, which by itself was very controversial. So in the end, this seemed to be a very satisfactory or wise move on the part of ERA advocates. And this is the language of the Equal Rights Amendment. So the part that is in bold is what was proposed as an amendment. So the first part here is to simply amend the beginning of the Bill of Rights in the Iowa Constitution. All men and women, all men and women are by nature free and equal and have inalienable rights and so forth. And then this latter part right here is the enforcement clause. Neither the state nor any of its subdivisions shall, on the basis of gender, deny or restrict equality of rights under the law. Now, amending the Iowa State Constitution is no easy feat. So the amendment has to be passed in 2 consecutive legislative sessions with an election between them, right? And then after that, it has to go to a vote of the people. So the first debate, excuse me, the first debate happened in 1978, and needless to say, there were fireworks. So in the Iowa House of Representatives, a number of ERA opponents attempted to add riders or amendments to the proposed Equal Rights Amendment that would have prohibited homosexual marriage or activity. There was a successful legislative maneuver on the part of ERA advocates that was used to bring a clean bill to the floor. But in the process of doing so, that nearly ended up in a fist fight between ERA advocates and those that opposed an ERA and wanted to add these riders. In the Senate actually did manage to attach a rider, which was called by one of its opponents weasel worded. And the quotation here is, "It is declared to the intent of the General Assembly in agreeing to the foregoing amendment to the Constitution of the state of Iowa that a classification on the basis of gender shall not be held to deny or restrict equality of rights if it can be established that such classification is necessary to accomplish state interest." What does that mean? Beats me. I think what it really means is that if the state sees fit to discriminate on the basis of sex, that it can. However, this was not a change to the amendment. It was simply an expression of intent. This meant that the House had to pass the same version with this rider attached in 1978, which they did. But in 1979, both the House and the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate passed a clean state ERA, which was sent to the voters in November of 1980. So by the time we get to 1980, as I said, the time limit for the national ERA had passed and was extended. But what we see in Iowa for the state ERA was that there was an absolutely huge coalition, over 20 organizations, labor unions, teachers organizations, every major women's group that you can think of. Democrats and Republicans together all favored the ERA, and it was actually very, very highly popular. The opposition was led by Donna Laporte, who I introduced a couple slides ago, and both sides brought in significant celebrities to campaign on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment in the Iowa Constitution. For the proponents, they brought in the humorist and columnist Irma Bombeck, who was very well known at the time. And for the opponents, Phyllis Schlafly came and campaigned against the Equal Rights Amendment. And from her nearby home in Alton, Illinois. The final tally was that the Equal Rights Amendment lost by 10 percentage points. And the arguments that were used in 1980 really did echo the arguments that were used on the national level. So there was concern about so-called homosexual rights. There were concerns about loss of public restrooms, unisex public restrooms, and so forth. And at the same time, those who were in favor were talking about sort of, the broader issues, the principles of equality and freedom and liberty, and lack of discrimination. And eventually the kind of fear mongering actually won out in the end. Interestingly enough, there was also an issue of the draft. So one of the things that Phyllis Schlafly said was, we don't want an ERA because women will be drafted. Never mind that Iowa does not have a standing army. It has a National Guard, and the National Guard is an all-volunteer force, as it was at the time. So advocates then took a break and waited for another attempt, which was undertaken in the late 80s and the early 90s. So once again, the voters in 1992 voted again on the Equal Rights Amendment for the Iowa Constitution, and the language is there. It is exactly the same language that was proposed in 1980. And advocates believed that they had that enough time had passed since 1980 to be able to try this again. And you can see here that the Iowa House and the Senate passed this amendment first in 1989, and again passed overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate. Once again, in the Iowa Senate, we see that Minette Dorter was the primary supporter and author of it, as well as this is Lieutenant Governor Ann Zimmerman, who was also actively involved in this. In the Iowa Senate, there was an attempt to amend this to say that the amendment would not be did not apply to abortion, and it was actually Ann Zimmerman who declared that amendment out of order. And then in January of 1991, again, the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate passed the amendment without any riders or amendments overwhelmingly. So the Equal Rights Amendment came before Iowa voters for a second time in 1992. And in 1992, Iowa was the only state that had a state equal rights amendment on its ballot. So it was guaranteed to be able to that it was going to generate national attention, and it certainly did. So among its opponents included the Eagle Forum, which was the successor to Stop ERA and was led by Phyllis Schlafly, and the Christian Coalition, which was led by the televangelist Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson was very well known in Iowa because he had campaigned for president here in 1988 and had come in second in the Republican caucuses that year. And the leader of the opposition, who said that she felt that she was guided by God or called by God to lead the opposition to the Iowa Equal Rights Amendment, was Marlene Elwell, who was from Michigan. And she was also active on Pat Robertson's presidential campaign in Iowa 4 years earlier. So she was well known within the state. The supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment were two groups that initially began to work together and then had a split over both strategy and personnel. So the first one was Iowa Women's Equality Campaign, which was funded entirely by the Fund for the Feminist Majority, led by Eleanor Smeal. And the second one was the ERA Iowa, which was an Iowa-based group. And again, we saw that celebrities were weighing in, and we were talking about really big names. So Phyllis Schlafly, again, became the principal opponent and traveled through the state. And at one point actually engaged in a debate against Eleanor Smeal, what they called the debate of the Titans on the Iowa Equal Rights Amendment. In favor of it were Eleanor Smeal, President Reagan's daughter, Maureen, Jean Stapleton, who was a famous actress who played on a sitcom, All in the Family, and Abigail Van Buren, in Iowa, who was known as an advice columnist. And they spent a lot of money. The pro-ERA organizations spent $165,000, and these are in 1992 dollars, and the anti-ERA organizations spent $80,000. Most of it was spent on personnel and on television ads. The anti-ERA forces especially did a huge ad blitz in the weeks immediately before the election in November, and they actually recycled the same ads that had been used effectively to defeat ERAs in Maine and in Vermont. And they showed things like men who were embracing and kissing each other and talking about, the problems with, homosexual rights and gay marriage that would be allowed under the ERA. And so even though the ERA had very strong public support and public opinion polls early in 1992, the amendment ended up losing again in November, but by 4 percentage points. Now, there were a lot of interesting things that happened along the way, right? So first of all, these two pro-ERA groups had conflicting messages and problematic strategies. And especially problematic for the Iowans who were involved was that the organizers for the fund that were paid by the Fund for the Feminist Majority were doing things in Iowa that were either illegal or against policy. For example, they were canvassing within the Iowa State Residence Halls, which is absolutely against the campus policy. And then the local Iowa group was getting blamed for this. And so there was real problems there in terms of coordinating their strategies. And it led to some pretty significant bad blood. The Eagle Forum was also charged with violating Iowa's campaign disclosure laws and had to pay fines as a result. In the middle of all this, Phyllis Schlafly's son, John, was outed by a San Francisco newspaper as a gay man. And John came out and said that he was in fact a gay man, but he agreed with his mother on most issues. And then Pat Robertson sent a fundraising letter out that said, among things, that it, meaning the ERA, is not about equal rights for women. It encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. And this letter was quoted all the time by ERA supporters as a way to show what they saw as the absurd and sexist motivations of the opponents. And so it became just sort of an ongoing theme about how they really think that people who support the ERA or feminists are in fact witches, among other things. Nonetheless, as we know, the Equal Rights Amendment lost in 1992. And once again, supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment sought to, try again. And that led to the attempt in 1998, which was known as It's Not an ERA. And this time, the proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment in the Iowa Constitution dropped the enforcement clause, and it became a two-word constitutional amendment, simply the words "and women." And as she was supporting it and introduced it now into the Iowa House of Representatives, Minette Dorderer said, "It is my greatest desire before I die to be in the Iowa Constitution." So without an enforcement clause, we found that the two-word amendment was actually overwhelmingly supported, right? So we see that it passed in 3 out of the 4 votes that were needed in the state legislature. There was actually no opposition and only nominal opposition in the Iowa House in 1995. So the two-word amendment comes before the voters in 1998. There is no organized opposition at all. Previous opposition groups were either in favor or neutral. Governor Branstad, who had opposed the Equal Rights Amendment earlier when he was in the state legislature, endorsed this two-word amendment. Both the Democratic and the Republican Party chairs sent out a joint letter in support of the state ERA. There were no TV commercials, there were no major media buys. And in November of 1998, the two-word amendment and women passed by a 2-to-1 margin. So where does that leave us today? Today, there are 26 states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia that have equal rights amendments or similar statements in their state constitutions or their governing documents. Sometimes those are codes, or they have different names for the territories in DC. The most recent state to have added an equal rights amendment to its constitution is Nevada, which did it just last year in 2022. What's going on nationally is that in 1982, when the extension expired, the Equal Rights Amendment was considered dead by its supporters and opponents. And feminists turned to other issues, and opponents turned especially to the opposition to legalized abortion. And that remained the case up until the late 1990s. In 1992, at the same time that voters were considering a state equal rights amendment in Iowa, nationally, the 27th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. The 27th Amendment's ratification history is completely unique. It took 203 years to be fully ratified by states and added to the Constitution. So this strange history of the 27th Amendment, which has to do with congressional pay, led to the development of something called the 3-state strategy. What the 3-state strategy says is that a constitutional amendment, any time limit on the ratification of a constitutional amendment, unless it is written into the amendment itself, is unconstitutional, because Article 5 of the Constitution, which lays out the amendment process, doesn't say anything at all about time limits. And so this started ERA advocates on the journey to find 3 more states, right? So this was called the 3-state strategy. I like to call it the 3 more state strategy. So it takes the 35 states that had ratified before by 1977, ignores the 5 states that rescinded, and sought 3 more states, which ratified in 2017, 2018, and 2020, respectively. They were Illinois, Virginia, and Nevada. And so now there is significant congressional efforts to remove the time limit from the Equal Rights Amendment and to direct the National Archives to add the ERA to the Constitution. This strategy, needless to say, is rather controversial. And what I really say is that the Equal Rights Amendment is more of the zombie amendment. It's neither really alive nor really dead. But at the same time, we do have something of an Equal Rights Amendment here in Iowa. So that concludes my presentation, and I am very much looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kedrowski, excuse me.
Kedrowski. Why don't we just go with Karen?
Wonderful, thank you. We have time to answer some questions. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please note we may not be able to get to all of the questions today. So the first question we have for you, Karen, is how did you originally become interested in researching this specific topic?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I have been following the Equal Rights Amendment, since I was in college. And, and I, like a lot of other people, really thought that it was, dead and gone. But when the opportunity to educate teachers and students about the history of the Equal Rights Amendment came up, I wanted to do that because really when I'm teaching this in class, my students don't know anything at all about the Equal Rights Amendment. We also know from public opinion polls that 75% of Americans think that the Constitution guarantees equal rights on the basis of sex. And by the way, it does not. But what I really discovered as I was doing this work was the very interesting Iowa story. And I pretty much stumbled upon that as I was reading about, how Iowa had voted and the things like that. So it's been an absolutely fascinating journey.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is, so where was your favorite place to find resources for your research? And then was there a favorite resource that you found, whether it helped advance your research or you just found interesting?
Oh, that's a great question too. I spent several days actually at the Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Library. And in there, they have Minette Dorer's papers. They also have papers of a number of other individuals, but also some of the primary organizations that were in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it was a very rich set of resources. They have some limited holdings actually from ERA opponents as well. So really great things like what the kind of buttons they wore, campaign buttons and things like that. I also found newspapers.com to be really, really helpful because I could narrow that down to Iowa newspapers and find out what Iowa newspapers were saying in the moment. And then to find out exactly how Iowans voted nationally, I used the congressional record. So that was really interesting to sit down and go through and figure out who these people were and how they had voted. And it's very clear that, Iowa reflected what was going on nationally, which was that there were Democrats and Republicans who supported the Equal Rights Amendment, and there were Democrats and Republicans who opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. So it was very much bipartisan coalitions on each side. And I saw that played out definitely when looking at the Iowa congressional delegations.
And then Karen, kind of an extension on that question there. When you were doing your research and you had found all these amazing resources, did you find that there were any gaps in your research or items that you struggled to find?
Yeah, I would say that one was that the collection of materials from Equal Rights Amendment opponents was much thinner. So we didn't really have a lot of information about strategies that they would have used. Their written record was just much thinner. So in order to make sure that I gave the opponents sort of equal time, I had to look elsewhere. So I ended up depending much more on media coverage. And then also some there was an unpublished dissertation and an unpublished master's thesis. And those were very helpful, especially the master's thesis, because they had done a great deal of interviewing with the anti-ERA activists to sort of figure out, like, how did they win when they weren't expected to. So not primary sources, but a couple of good secondary sources, but I wish I had had some more.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question, do you know any reasons why the amendments had little opposition within the Iowa legislature, but the first two attempts failed the public vote?
Yeah, that's that's really great. So little opposition in the legislature because it's always, the ERA has always enjoyed the support of somewhere between 50 and 60% of the American public. So the reason that it failed in 1980 and 1992 has to do with the really effective rhetorical strategies that were used by ERA opponents. So things that we take for granted today, right, like same-sex marriage and women in combat, were really powerful and scary messages, 40 and 35 years ago and 30 years ago. And so it was sort of unthinkable that gay men and lesbian women would be teaching in schools, or that they should be married, or they should be raising children. They were seen as much more socially deviant than what the mainstream sees them today. And so those kind of scary things were very powerful. But also, anytime you brought up women in combat or women in the military, it raised a specter of Vietnam. And so I think it was brilliant to bring those arguments into Iowa, even if they weren't relevant, just because the draft at the end of the Vietnam War was extraordinarily unpopular. And it really placed ERA advocates on the defensive to have to defend that women would be sent off to war, or that they would be placed in foxholes like men were in really dreadful conditions in Vietnam.
Wonderful answer, thank you. Our next question focuses on what is the current status of the Equal Rights Amendment and how could you see it moving forward?
Oh my goodness, like I said, the ERA is neither alive nor dead. So the last state to ratify as part of this 3-state strategy, or what I like to think of as a 3 more state strategy, is Virginia. And that was in 2020, in late January of 2020. Knowing that Virginia was likely to ratify, the Trump administration, Department of Justice, issued a directive to the National Archivist. So to back up for a second, when states ratify an amendment under current law, what they do is they have to send the paperwork to the director of the National Archives and Records Administration. And that person is called the National Archivist. And the archivist looks at it, makes sure everything is legit, and then adds that to either the tally for, in favor of the amendment. And then once there are the requisite 3/4 states, will actually declare that an amendment has been added to the Constitution. So that's the official process, right? Well, knowing that Virginia was getting ready to do this, the Trump administration's Department of Justice issued a directive to the National Archivist that said essentially the Equal Rights Amendment moment has passed. The deadline is long gone. These late ratifications are null and void, and don't add the amendment to the Constitution. So when Virginia went ahead and did the paperwork, the archivist didn't do anything, took no action to add the ERA to the Constitution. At that point, Virginia, Illinois, and Nevada took the National Archivist to court, and federal district court in Washington, D.C., and argued that the court needed to direct the National Archivist to accept their ratifications. The district court ruled against the plaintiffs and said that the ERA was dead. And the appeals court did the same thing, ruled that it was again, that the ERA was dead. By this point, we've had a presidential election. and we get a new president named Biden. The Biden administration, Department of Justice, puts out another memo. They don't rescind the Trump era memo, but they issue a clarification. And this clarification says essentially, well, yeah, the ERA's time limit has passed, but all Congress has to do is pass a law that directs the National Archivist to ignore it and to go ahead and accept these late rescissions. So this left the Congress doing three things, right? So there are sort of three strategies going on right now. Number one is to start over, reintroduce the amendment, get it passed through Congress, and have to go before the states again. This would be successful only with the very questionable assumption that the states that ratified it starting in 1972 would ratify it again. The second one is to pass a law that simply deletes the time limit from the accompanying legislation for the Equal Rights Amendment. And with that deletion, then there would be no time limit, and therefore all the ratifications are valid. The third one is to pass a law that would direct the National Archivist to accept these late ratifications and to be able to add this to the Constitution. These resolutions have been introduced into both the House and the Senate. In 2021, in 2021 and in early 2022, the House had passed the resolution saying there is no time limit on the ERA. The Senate took no action. After 2022, in early 2023, the House has taken no action on these resolutions at all under the Republican majority. The Senate actually had hearings and a floor vote on the resolution to eliminate the time limit. And it was filibustered, and while 51 senators voted to break the filibuster, they voted on cloture. That was not enough to stop debate. So it is essentially dead right now. But I would expect that all of these resolutions will be introduced into the next Congress in 2025. That was a long answer to the question.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. This is our last question we have here today, but it's kind of a two-parter. So can you explain a little about the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics? How can people find out more about that? And then where can people find out more about your research specifically?
Oh, great. Okay, so the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics was founded in 1992. So we have just gotten done celebrating our 30th anniversary. And its mission is really sort of inspired by Carrie Chapman Catt's life. So number one is that we research and promote women's political participation. We collect a lot of research on women as political actors, but with a particular focus on Iowa. So cataloging who holds what kinds of offices in Iowa and, progress towards equality. Carrie Chapman Catt, also as the founder of the League of Women Voters, was very interested in civic engagement and civic education. She wanted all people to be able to vote. She wanted universal suffrage in the truest sense. But she also wanted to make sure that people were educated and informed on issues. So we do a lot of civic education and voter engagement on campus, and as a way of making sure that our students are really prepared for citizenship in the 21st century. So the Catt Center is a great website. cattcenter.iastate.edu, or if you go to the Iowa State website and just enter in the CATT, C-A-T-T Center, you will find it. And this curriculum is available under our tab for educators. You can also see all of our research there, and you can subscribe to our newsletter and anything else that you would want to know. And my contact information is also in the slide deck.
And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Karen. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. While you are there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on August 24th. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.